Yeah.
because I'm stubborn, and I didn't even look to see what could get the mosaic virus. I just kind of went for it. And once I removed it, I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. So we're looking, and the bed next to it's even worse because I have a trellis on it, and then I have the tunnel on the other side, so it's boxed in at a 90-degree angle, and I can only get in on two sides. So it's really complicated, and I'm looking to change that as well. I need to keep it so one section is blocked, and even that needs to be. I need to be very careful about that as well.
Yeah, I was trying to look and see, and I don't want to make a declaration, but
No, don't do that.
it looks like the trellis that I have, the cattle panel, the infamous cattle panel trellis that I basically two sets in the front yard garden. That was the vision. That was the initial design. In 2019, when I broke ground on the front yard garden, that was what I needed to add to it. Like that completed the look. And I was just checking, and I think almost half of the years the trellis has been filled like as I expected, like things have actually trellised up and vine and crops have grown. Then the other half, the more recent years, it's not. I've had an empty trellis. And
You've had an
it's
empty trellis
interesting.
in your garden for the past couple of years.
Yeah.
How does that make you
Not
feel?
intentionally. Say again.
How does that make you feel?
Oh, it didn't make me happy at all.
No,
That's where
it's
I'm headed.
terrible, isn't it? It
Yeah,
hurts.
I'm headed to like, Frownyville, dude. Like it's like that's such a stark reminder of like, for lack of a better term, a fail.
Yeah.
Like that wasn't part of the design this year. That wasn't part of the design last year when it was empty. And it wasn't part of the design the year before when it was empty. But here we are with an empty trellis. And now I'm going into next year thinking, all right, let's get back to our method for the first 3 years when I actually had a full trellis. But what it has done, it's reminded me, because I'm not picking food from the actual trellis, it reminded me how difficult it is to get to the beds the trellises are sitting basically, adjacent to, right? And so it's like clearly I've grown food without anything growing on these trellises. I'm not, again, it's just not a declaration, but I wonder what it would be like to garden without that trellis there, without those two sets. I would have basically there are four sides to the beds. I'd have access to three sides.
Yeah.
And remember, I put those little narrow beds in between to try to expand the growing space, which makes it even more difficult to get inside of either of the beds that are sitting in the front yard garden. So
Right.
I've literally, I'm like young David. I've painted myself into a corner where I can access these beds from this side or this side, and that's it.
Yeah.
And in the beginning of the season, it's like everything's gravy. It's all good. But let something get 2 feet tall, like I'm like quite literally climbing inside of the bed to pull out the plants.
Yeah, that's how I am too. And you said something that really rung in my head, and it's in the beginning of the season, it's great. But and it always seems that way, doesn't it? It's like the beginning of the season, everything works out, everything is good, it's all kosher. And I mean, your grandmother, was it your grandma that had this saying, the garden runs wild towards the end of, and it does. And once things start growing and getting big and taking over, then that's when the issues arise when it comes to this
Yeah.
stuff. So you know, trellises are a love of mine, but I'm actually thinking this year of adding another cattle, not a cattle panel, a hog panel. Have you
What's the
seen those?
difference?
It's a hog
No.
panel is half the size.
Oh, okay, okay.
It's the same length, but it's half the width.
Hmm.
So that would be enable me to have a little bit more space. This year I had that Seminole pumpkin just go absolutely insane. You know what? It doesn't need a whole 4 foot trellis, 4 foot wide trellis. I could get away with a plant on a 2 foot wide trellis and then have another 2 feet in front of it once it goes to be able to get inside of my garden and work. Access
Yeah.
is everything. And I don't want to harp on this too much, but getting out of your way and eliminating friction is going to help your garden dramatically, no matter how you look at it. You're going to be able to get in there and work and weed and fertilize and dig and harvest and remove everything a lot faster than if you did, if you paint yourself in a box like that.
But there's a thing to consider when it comes to the spaces we're growing in. Of course, we're trying to make the most of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That trellis in the front yard was the most traditional of trellises in my garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely was a permanent structure. Like other trellises that I create, like they may come down at the end of the season. I may not leave them up the next season. It's been there since 2019. And that has been the only place that's made sense for me in my garden mind to grow melons. Now, ask me if I've grown melons in these last 3 years when there's been an empty trellis.
Have you grown melons on the trellis in the last 3 years since it's been empty?
No, no, I've not. That's like, and it's the when you said the hog panels and it's half the size. I thought about this for a split second. It just triggered that memory. Like, what if the entire set of beds is a 10-foot long bed? So two, if you're watching the video, hey, so two 10-foot long beds are sitting basically here. And then there's the trellis that goes over it, creating that hoop, if you will. And then there are two small, narrow beds sitting inside of the trellis, right? But it's 10 feet. Do I really need all 10 feet of that trellis, even? So, what I thought about a couple of years ago is what if I just removed one? At least I'd be able to get to half of the bed easily.
Right.
So a part of making the most of your space. And then to be quite frank, what do you do with all of this stuff? That's a pretty big structure to take down and move somewhere in my garden space. So it's
Yeah.
almost left up by default. Now again, I'm not making any declarations. I'm not saying I'm going to stop growing on this trellis. Stop trying to grow on the trellis because I've not been growing on the trellis the last few years. But it's something. It's going back to our subscriber episode. Sometimes you have to stop and consider: do I need to tear it all down and start over? I'm
Yeah.
going to use that loosely.
Rip it all out.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's not something that's a pleasurable thought, but I mean, there's a benefit to starting with a blank slate and starting over. And I mean, so what? We're just referring to trellises right now, but you pull the trellises out and you start over. You already have done the work in the soil, the garden beds. It's all that still there. Nobody's saying really removing that unless you have to. But as far as like the structures and stuff like that, it's not really the end of the world. There's a lot more that you can do, and removing that stuff can make or break a garden, I think, and really revitalize that space so you could do more with it.
I think one of the first steps that we often don't take is taking a step back and really determining whether or not it's serving you well.
Mm-hmm.
Like it may have served me well those first 3 years, and maybe it doesn't. Or maybe it served me really well, and then I tried to enhance it further, and I basically undercut myself,
Yeah.
right? I undid the good that was already kind of I developed in that space. So it's something to think about. I have a couple of explanations as to why here we are year three on not growing, on the trellis. And I feel like I still want to use that space for that purpose, but I have to be super intentional about it, you
Right.
know.
Yeah. Um, I think we need to move on from trellises though.
I'm okay